For a long time, I haven't cared for the term, the national question. It seems a little abstract to me, though it really isn't. It's precise in many ways. If it was me, if we had to sort of rename it, it would be something like, how to unite the workers and the oppressed question, because that's really what it deals with. I don't want to speak too long. I did give a class a few months ago, went over some historical stuff, but I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions or thoughts about it. And if you don't have any, this is going to be a really dull class, and I'll be just going on, and I'm not sure that that's all that great. As I just said, the national question from a revolutionary Marxist perspective is really about what communists and revolutionary socialists must do to ensure the unity of the workers and the oppressed so that we are not divided and that imperialism benefits from that division. It's important to state that plain, because the national question, of course, is more complex than the struggle against racism. But practically speaking, that's a lot of it, the struggle against racism. And the motivation or the different class motivations or ideological motivations for the struggle against racism can get all confused. There's idealism, which is good as a beginning for a revolutionary, as long as they evolve and have a materialist view at some point. There's bullshit liberalism, which claims to be anti-racist, especially during election time. And it's so easy when you're running against Trump, to embrace the oppressed and, show how you're better, but, it's a cover. It's a cover for imperialism. They're phony anti-racism. It's a cover for neoliberalism, for globalism, i.e. Hillary Clinton and this banker who just won in France. What's his name? Macron. And it has nothing to do. That is a revolutionary view of the Marxist of the national question. Has nothing to do with being politically correct or feeling guilty. Those are petty bourgeois notions and ideas. And if you base yourself on that, you won't get far. You won't get very far at all. The origins of the national question are more or less this. As the working class movement was developing in the 1800s, when Marx was around, and the Communist Manifesto and Capital was written, and the First International was established, there was some talk about colonies and what should our position be on oppressed nations, but not much. Probably Ireland more than anything else. It wasn't until the late 1800s and the early 1900s when imperialism was reaching a certain dangerous, warlike, incredible, monster octopus-like stage. There had been colonies before then. Ruling classes, even under feudalism, were sending armies to conquer oppressed people and rip them off and rip off their natural resources. They've been doing that for centuries. And of course there's slavery, etc., etc. But it wasn't until the late 1800s and the turn of the century and the first imperialist war where the national question became a huge issue. And the revolutionary movement, led by Lenin at that time, had to deal with it. What is our position? Prior to that, it was all about class. All of the agitation was against nations. There should be no nations. The working class is nationless. We should not see ourselves as a nation. There are no borders for the working class. And that was good stuff. But a contradiction developed at this high state of the development of imperialism, when the imperialist countries were literally fighting each other to divide up the planet, to see who would have which colonies, especially around that time in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and of course on this side of the globe, in the Americas. And it was before the communist movement. Well, there are not just nations. There are oppressor nations, imperialists, and there are oppressed nations, nations that are colonized. As a matter of fact, sometimes the national question was referred to as the colonial question, which in some ways, especially back then, I think was more adequate, more easy to understand. And in the colonies, there are movements, to no one's surprise, to free themselves from their colonizers. The movements took on many forms. They were led by different political tendencies at different times. Sometimes it was bourgeois nationalists in India, or sometimes in China before Mao and the great Chinese Communist Party, or this or that country in Africa. Sometimes it was petty bourgeois elements. Sometimes it was, the comprador, colonial military, And sometimes it was communists, Marxist-Leninists. We always thought it was better when it was Marxist-Leninists who were in the front of the national liberation movements. But there were growing national liberation struggles for self-determination, which for the most part meant independence. We want to separate ourselves from the oppressor nation. We want independence. And this was a contradictory issue for communists because they had been talking about class. We frown on nations. We frown on national identity. We want to rid the world of nations, so why would we be for a nation freeing itself to become a nation independent from another nation? Didn't that seem like a contradiction? And there were struggles inside the communist movement. We can address that. Some of the things that you may have read in preparation for this class address that. But finally, the communist movement made the right decision under Lenin's leadership. Not just him, but he was very decisive. That the working class movement, led by communists, should support the national liberation movements for self-determination against the imperialists, against the colonizers. And while we care who's in the leadership, we have an opinion about that. That is not decisive, and our support for the liberation struggles will not be based on who may be in the leadership of that. That our support will be more or less unconditional. And so this was a turning point. And as a result, it was around that time. I think this is one of the biggest, most popular outgrowths of that period, of that struggle. The communist slogan was changed from workers of the world unite to workers in oppressed nations unite. At some point, some people began using oppressed peoples, which is good for another reason. And it was a turning point. The movement embraced the struggle of oppressed peoples for national liberation. What we also realized as the movement, as revolutionaries, is that the national liberation struggle was not merely geographical, that sometimes colonized people were inside nations. Slavery, the indigenous people, how black and brown people are treated all over the world, especially inside the big imperialist powers. All of the people who have been forced to go to Europe, not just decades ago, I mean, for a long time now, people from former colonies that are neo-colonies, really, in essence, have been going to European imperialist countries for the same reason that people come to the U.S. from Jamaica, or from Central America, or from other neo-colonies in the South. For economic reasons, they're forced to come here. They're not dragged here like slaves, but in some ways it's just as bad. They don't want to leave. They come here for economic reasons. And so nations are internalized. And it's even more complicated than that, because over periods of time, oppressed people, colonized people are absorbed into the working class. They're integrated into the working class. And what distinguishes them sometimes seems like it's the color of their skin. But that's an important thing. Race is very important. Race is central to national and colonial oppression. But there usually are other things that distinguish them. Usually they make less. Usually they live less. They don't live as long. Usually their overall social condition is much less than those sections of society, including the working class, that are relatively and temporarily, underscore temporarily, more privileged. Now, our party has a glorious and distinguished record in fighting for national liberation for colonized and oppressed people around the world and here at home. And the letter that Comrade Sam wrote, it must be almost 60 years ago, a letter to a comrade in the Deep South, outlines the party's view toward the black struggle, the black liberation movement, which was in its early stages, or at least that phase of the black liberation movement that took over the 60s. Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Movement. At that time, there were two wings of the black liberation movement. There was the moderate wing, led by Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights wing of the movement. And while we preferred the revolutionary black liberation wing of the movement, led by Malcolm, and later on the Black Panthers and others, we supported both because we felt that was the right thing to do. Our leaders in this party felt that the black struggle, that the national struggle, the anti-racist struggle in general, and the black struggle in particular, was so central to unity, to unifying the working class, and to the success of the working class in its struggle against capitalism and ultimately for socialism, and for building a multinational working class, that we put aside almost everything else around that time, around the time that Sam Marcy wrote this letter. For those of you who don't know, he was the founder of our party. To support and do everything we can, find every way we could, resources, finances, trips, comrade power, legal help, defending people, sometimes arms, to support this growing black liberation struggle. What Sam did in this letter was go over a few of the big mistakes that he felt the left and the working class movement had made over the past 100 years, since the struggle against slavery, and more particularly, the struggle against the counter-revolution against Reconstruction. Did Alani come here to give the class on?
Yes.
Yeah. So you know a little bit about Reconstruction and how important that was. You know, it was a contradictory movement because it was instigated and led by bourgeois forces, but because it unleashed the social power of freed slaves, you know, in the struggle to get back some of what was stolen from them and what was owed to them. It was a tremendous liberating struggle that dominated about a decade. 60s, mid-70s, mid-60s to the mid-70s. And then there was a counter-revolution against it by the Klan, led by the Southern bourgeoisie, supported by the Northern bourgeoisie. A bloody counter-revolution. And Sam's critique was that even though there was a growing working class movement fighting for the 8-hour day, fighting for child labor laws, fighting for a 6-day week, fighting for basic labor rights, and many people in the leadership of this movement considered themselves socialists and were aware of the existence of Marx and the Communist Manifesto. They, in general, with few exceptions, did not come to the support of the black masses in the South who were suffering a violent counter-revolution against their Reconstruction. Part of it was geographical isolation, but that alone cannot excuse the absence of support. The progressive leaders of the labor movement in the big cities, in New York and Chicago, and in places where they were developing industry, they did not show up because they felt that if they made a big issue out of supporting black people against the Klan, that it would alienate other white workers. It was as simple as that. And so they caved on it. And it's a painful but important lesson, because we see all too often, this is so much the case with the immigrant struggle, that leaders in the working class movement, labor leaders, will not say that these are our comrades. These immigrant workers are our comrades. And they should be in our union no matter what industry they're in, no matter what their status is, whether they're undocumented or whatever, you know, because our struggle, our class has no borders. But they don't do this because in all too many cases, a big chunk of the working class, mostly the white working class, but sometimes workers of color too, you know, they watch the same lies and racist propaganda, you know, 24/7, you know. They hear that immigrants are taking our jobs, or that they're dirty, or that they're rapists, and all the Trump stuff that you hear. And it has an effect. And so leaders in the working class movement are afraid to do what they should do if they really want to hold the working class together. And that's raise this issue and fight for unity. It happens so many times, time and time throughout history. I think the other thing that Sam raises in that letter is the Marcus Garvey movement. That's a very interesting case. I think these days very few young activists, I could be wrong about this, very few young activists know about the Garvey movement. This was a movement of the 20s. They might have heard about the Panthers, they might have even heard about the Nation of Islam, you know, movements that were a generation or 2 generations ago. But the Garvey movement was, even compared to the Civil Rights Movement, the biggest movement of black people, the biggest movement of the black population to date. It was embraced.
Is that geophysical movement or social movement?
Both. It was an anti-racist liberation movement. Garvey was a very complex, very interesting leader, but he was no Marxist. And he was not a champion of the working class. And the biggest, I mean, there were some other demands at different times that he had, but his biggest demand was that you give us the means to get back to Africa from where you stole us as slaves. And this resonated. But because he was not a communist, and because he was not embracing the class struggle, those who called themselves communists and socialists at the time, and I'm talking particularly about white communists and socialists, they attacked him. Some of them even called him fascist. They called Malcolm X fascist too, and bourgeois nationalists. And because of this, a number of parties, including the Communist Party, which at different times had hundreds of thousands of black members, was very big in the South. They lost black members and alienated the black community because of their bad position. And this is where we differed. Yes, we are not with Marcus Garvey ideologically. We are against capitalism, we are for communism, we are for building a multi-racial class, a front in the struggle against capitalism. But if there is a liberation movement from ex-slaves that promotes the demand of going back to Africa, and this is embraced, we are going to support it. Just as we would support, and this was one of the demands that was around for a while. It isn't talked about, and it's not popular now, except for maybe a handful of people. There was some in the communist movement, and some in the black liberation movement during the 20s and 30s that were for the slave states being taken over by the black population and being allowed to separate and form their own black nation, a separate black nation in the South. I haven't heard talk about that for a long time, but it was popular. I think it was more popular in the South for obvious reasons, for the same reasons that people come from Central America or all over the world to come to the U.S. You know, there were, in addition to Jim Crow, there were huge migrations from the South to the Midwest and to the East and to the West, because that's where industry was, and that's where things were a little bit better in relationship to Jim Crow. But again, our critique of the Communist Party was that because they didn't support the program of the Garvey movement, they lost a lot of influence in the black community. And it was devastating to them. They got some of it back based on the many, many good struggles that they're associated with. The struggles, so many cases, there are famous ones and ones that are less famous, to defend prisoners and other victims and so forth, and class struggles, workers and sharecroppers unity. I mean, the CP was very, very big, not just in the South, but all over the country. But this is where we parted with them, and we continue to part with them. We parted with them, and we parted with many who consider themselves socialists and communists over Malcolm X and over the Black Panthers, who were criticized. And even when the Black Panthers, I know you're all familiar to some extent with the Black Panther Party, even when they were under attack and being physically destroyed by the FBI, some groups stood aside. And their excuse was, well, we don't support them, they don't support our program, yada, yada, yada. Even though what was remarkable about the Black Panther Party, I mean, there were so many tremendous reasons to support them. Unlike Garvey, unlike the Nation of Islam, and unlike a number of earlier incarnations of the black struggle, the Black Panthers became Marxist. They were influenced by Mao. They were influenced by Fidel. They were influenced by Cuba. They were influenced by the national liberation struggles around the world going on at the same time. They were influenced by the Vietnamese. And so their political and ideological development in terms of an oppressed struggle, I don't think there's any group that has surpassed them. And you can well imagine why the ruling class wanted to physically and publicly crush them. And they did. And if Sam's letter had been written in 1972 instead of 1959, he would have added how, and you know, many in them, I don't want to give you the impression that there weren't many defenders of the Black Panther Party in the left. There were. And there were defense committees. And I'm proud that my party was central to that. But still, it was hardly enough. It was not decisive. It could not push the state back. And if we were writing this letter in 1972, he would have added another critique, and that was the leadership of the working class and their abandonment of the Black Panther Party. There are other things that I could talk about, the history of the various liberation struggles here in this country, our party's record, the differences on the left, which are always interesting. Sometimes there's something to learn from them. But I'm going to stop at this point, and I hope that if you have questions about those things, you know, that you'll share that. I will say this. The national question, or what we need to do to ensure the unity of the workers and the oppressed, it couldn't be more decisive now because of Trump. And Trumpism is a global phenomenon. It is a section of the imperialist ruling class at a time when capitalism is in a irreversible crisis. Dealing with that crisis by, in part, by targeting the most oppressed sections of the working class and turning white workers against them. Black and brown, immigrant workers, Arabs and Muslims. This is what's happening now. This is what happens in Europe. You know, it was a factor in the elections that took place yesterday. And I mean, for a lot of young activists, regardless of race and nationality, it must be very challenging. It must be very confusing. I think there are some out there, you know, after the Trump election, who may even be ready to write the working class off, or what they consider the white working class. I mean, how could we want to embrace the working class, look to the working class as an agent of revolutionary change if they can elect, you know, on the basis of this racist, misogynist, reactionary, neo-fascist program, you know? So there's no more important time than today, comrades, for us to find the ways to hold our class together in the face of this very dangerous, violent effort to break it apart. Because at the end of the day, this is really what Trumpism is about. It's about crushing the working class. And they understand that. They're clear on that, you know. That's why it was so important for us to do, as a party, and everybody who considers themselves progressive and knows anything about the working class, it was so important for them to do anything they could to support whatever strike immigrant workers would be able to mount on May 1st. We still don't know what kind of strike took place. I don't think enough reports are in. I think the strike was probably bigger in the West than it was in this part of the country. And I think it may have been somewhat bigger in the Midwest, in places like Chicago, but I'm just speculating, and I don't want to divert. We can talk about that, but that's a separate and related issue. But what we did in supporting that strike, or an effort to have a strike, whatever its success or lack thereof was, it wasn't based on idealism. It wasn't based on liberalism. It wasn't based on political correctness. It was based on, we got to hold our class together. And I've made this point a number of times in a number of presentations recently, and I think that it's one of the truest things that one can say now. It's not just splitting up our class that the ruling class is doing under Trump's leadership, or trying to do, by attacking the immigrants. It's also their realization that the immigrant working class is, generally speaking, more politically advanced than other sections of the working class. They brought the tradition of May Day back to the U.S. They brought stronger class consciousness. They brought concepts like striking and a general strike back here. I'm not saying that they're all revolutionary, I can't back that up. But I'm saying generally, in comparison to the low level of political consciousness amongst certain sections of our class. And so there are a lot of reasons why the capitalists want to decapitate the immigrant working class, because they want to divide us, but also because they don't want us getting, revolutionary ideas that might come from immigrants. By the way, this was true at the turn of the 19th century. The Communist Party, the labor movement, the anarchist movement, the revolutionary movements, they were built by immigrant workers. At that time, they were coming from Italy and Ireland and other places, and also Africa and Asia and so forth. Is there a silver lining in any of this? I think there may be. And I say this cautiously as I'm trying to wind up. This is the materialist basis for racism. One of the materialist bases for it, from the point of view of the imperialists. They know it well. How have they been able to ensure a relative political stability in the big imperialist countries? First and foremost, the United States, and then, the European imperialist powers. How have they been able, for decade after decade, especially since the Second Imperialist War, how have they been able to maintain political stability, push back class consciousness, sort of limit the growth of the radical organizations in the working class, the revolutionary organizations, the communist and socialist organizations? Well, one of the ways they've done it is to use the wealth that they have stolen from colonized people, both from their natural resources and for super exploiting their labor. And this is why imperialism is rich and the ruling class is rich. Use a little bit of that wealth, a very little bit about it, what we would consider a few crumbs, and put it on the table, and in a way buy off a section of the working class on the basis of imperialist loot. But guess what? They're not able to do that anymore, because we're in a phase of capitalism and imperialism where they just can't do that. And the contradictions, the chickens are coming home to roost, so to speak. We could take that up more in an economics class, which would be a good thing. Maybe you've already done it, But they can't buy sections of the working class off, That's why there are no union jobs that can satisfy a section and have a house and have the car and the garage and, college for the kids and all that stuff. That's why all that stuff we've seen been wiped out. It's been several generations now. And it's sort of reached a kind of zenith of it. This is the reason why, one of the reasons why there is an epidemic of suicide and a drug abuse epidemic in some of these white working class communities that we haven't seen. What's happening, and this was inevitable, and again, it's not just the US, it's a global phenomenon. In this phase of capitalism at a dead end, that section of the working class and the middle class that was relatively and temporarily more privileged than black and brown workers, than women workers, that's being leveled. That's being leveled. And it's brutal. It's a brutal awakening. And in some ways, those of us who have been around as long as I have, and perhaps Sharon, I think we're not surprised that some workers are freaking out and would even buy into Trump's bullshit for a short while. When you have been benefiting, even a little bit, from some relative privilege, but in order for you to change your way of thinking, in order for you to become revolutionary, in order for you to gain political consciousness and class consciousness, so you can do something that will really liberate you, like getting rid of capitalism, some stuff has to happen. There are big sections of the working class on a global basis, especially in the big imperialist countries, who are going through a very difficult process, And so it's no surprise that they would flirt with all sorts of neo-fascism. Let's blame the immigrants, let's blame black people, let's blame women, let's try to go back to the 1950s, let's try to go back a century and let's turn things back, and delusions like this. This will not last. It's a temporary kind of delusional phase that a section of the working class is going through. We should not give up on them. And once they get through this, they will be more available to revolutionary ideas, because capitalism will not offer any solution for them. But here's the thing. So in a manner of speaking, the working class, or at least sections of the working class, may be crossing a very difficult bridge that it just had to cross in order to shed all of its illusions. Patriotism, the belief in America, loyalty to Wall Street, loyalty to imperialism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They just had to go through a process that would be traumatizing. But they're going to get there. But here's the thing. We can't allow our class to be decimated by racism in the process. Because if we don't defend our class, which means defending those who are under attack, once the rest of the class gets across the bridge, there'll be nothing left. And that's why our party views itself, and we don't claim to be perfect, and we don't claim not to make errors, not to make mistakes, but we view ourselves and our growth and our influence as being central, decisive to holding the working class in this country together against this racism. Our party and its allies and fellow thinkers, The national question, the struggle against racism, is our heart and soul. It's not just theoretical. Behavior is political. It's one thing to read something. It's one thing to be able to quote Lenin. It's one thing to be able to refer to something that happened 50 years ago. And that's all good, and it has its place. But how we behave, our attitude is political. How we act amongst the oppressed, the sensitivity that we show to them, not based on liberalism or guilt, but based on understanding, what they've gone through and where they're at. Even something as simple as having a progressive stack in a meeting. In other words, recognizing black and brown people and women, It's not based on liberalism. A lot of people get that confused. It's based on this. If you have not been heard in other places, you will be heard here. That's what it's meant to say. You have been in the back of the bus. You have been silenced. Well, we're reversing that. You will go first. You will be the first heard. It's a way of bringing our class together. But knowing that the way to do that is to not admonish the oppressed and try to get them to understand why they have to put aside their grievances and put aside their history of oppression and understand white workers and what they're going through. Somebody has to understand that, and a multinational party does understand that. No, the shoe is on the other foot. The shoe is on the other foot. It is for the white workers in general, especially those who are struggling to be revolutionary, to understand what the oppressed workers have gone through and to take the first step. That's how you forge unity. That's how you do it. Attitude is so important. I could. There's so many instances of it. I was in France a long time ago, and it makes me think of the situation there now. And I was with some very strong communists. They were the left wing of the French Communist Party. Very good. They were against Euro-communism and Gorbachev back in the 80s, and fighting against the collapse of the Soviet Union and so forth. Very good comrades. But I'd sit and eat with them, and they would tell me how afraid they were to go into the African and Arab communities. And sometimes they would either say something like how dirty it was there, or how filthy it was in the street, or something like that. And I'd sit there, or criticize Islam, and I'd sit there and say, you're not going to build a party this way. You're building a wall, and it's true here. Let's face it, it's true here. Anyway, I've rambled enough. That's it. All right, welcome.